A privileged heir's life turns upside down when his father cuts him off, forcing him to live in the projects and work at a community center. But as he falls for the center's passionate director Janelle, his father's vengeful schemes threaten to destroy not just their love but the entire community they've built together. But before we continue with this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The morning sun shone through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Carrington mansion as Blake Carrington stumbled into the grand foyer, his designer clothes wrinkled from another night of partying. His father, Walter Carrington, stood at the top of the marble staircase, holding a newspaper with Blake's face splashed across the front page. "Carrington air crashes yacht into marina, 3 injured," screamed the headline. "That's it, Blake. I've had enough," Walter's voice boomed through the mansion. His face was red with anger, veins bulging on his forehead. "This is the last time you embarrass this family." Blake ran his fingers through his disheveled hair and smirked. "Come on, Dad. Nobody got hurt badly. I'll write them a check and everything will be fine. That's how it always works, right?" Walter descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the silent mansion. The household staff had mysteriously disappeared, knowing what was coming. "Not this time, son. This time things are going to be very different." Blake rolled his eyes and flopped onto an antique sofa worth more than most people's cars. "What are you going to do? Ground me? I'm 28 years old." "You're right. You are 28 years old, and it's time you learned what that means." Walter pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "You're cut off, effective immediately." Blake sat up straight, his hangover forgotten. "What do you mean, cut off?" "I mean exactly what I said. Your credit cards are cancelled. Your trust fund is frozen. Your car will be returned to the dealership today. You're going to learn what it means to live in the real world." Blake laughed, but it was hollow. "This is ridiculous. Where am I supposed to live? What am I supposed to do?" Walter handed him the envelope. "Inside you'll find an address. It's an apartment in Cedar Grove Heights." "The projects?" Blake's face went pale. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life. You'll also find information about a job I've arranged for you at a local community center. Minimum wage. You start Monday." Blake jumped to his feet. "This is insane. I'll call Mom." "Your mother agrees with me," Walter cut him off. "For once, we're on the same page about your future. This isn't a punishment, Blake. It's an opportunity to become the man I know you can be. And if I refuse?" Walter's expression hardened. "Then you'll get nothing, not a penny, not now, not in my will. You'll truly be on your own." Blake stared at his father, waiting for him to crack a smile, to say it was all a joke. But Walter's face remained stern and determined. "You have until tonight to pack whatever you can fit in one suitcase," Walter continued. "James will drive you to your new apartment. Everything else stays here." "Dad, please." Blake's voice cracked, reality finally setting in. "I'm done enabling you, son. It's time for you to learn what real life is like for most people. Maybe then you'll understand the value of everything you've taken for granted." Blake watched helplessly as his father climbed the stairs, leaving him alone in the foyer with the envelope that would change his life forever. That evening, Blake sat in the back of the family's Mercedes for the last time, watching through tinted windows as the wealthy neighborhoods gave way to increasingly modest surroundings. His one suitcase, packed with designer clothes that would look ridiculous in his new neighborhood, sat beside him. James, who had driven him since he was a child, kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror with a mixture of pity and hope. "It might not be as bad as you think, Mr. Blake," he offered quietly. Blake said nothing, his throat tight with anger and fear. The car finally pulled up in front of a worn apartment building with peeling paint and a broken security gate. A group of teenagers lounged on the front steps, eyeing the luxury car suspiciously. "We're here, Mr. Blake," James said softly. "Would you like me to help you with your bag?" "No," Blake replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I can manage." He stepped out of the car, the summer heat hitting him like a wall. The teenagers whispered and snickered as he retrieved his designer suitcase from the trunk. James handed him a set of keys, and Blake noticed his hands were shaking as he took them. "Good luck, Mr. Blake," James said, and for a moment, Blake thought he saw tears in the old driver's eyes. Then the car door closed and the Mercedes pulled away, leaving Blake standing alone on the cracked sidewalk. One of the teenagers called out, "Hey, rich boy, nice suitcase." Blake gripped the handle tighter and walked toward the building entrance, trying to ignore the laughter behind him. The key stuck in the front door lock, and he had to jiggle it several times before it finally turned. Inside, the hallway smelled of cooking oil and disinfectant. The elevator had an "out of order" sign taped to it. Blake checked the apartment number on his key, 4B, 4 flights of stairs. Perfect. By the time he reached his floor, he was sweating through his silk shirt. The apartment door was scratched and dented, but at least the lock worked smoothly. He stepped inside and flicked the light switch. Nothing happened. "Welcome home," he muttered to himself in the darkness, fumbling for his phone's flashlight. The beam revealed a studio apartment smaller than his closet at home. A narrow bed sat against one wall, a kitchenette occupied one corner, and a door presumably led to a bathroom he wasn't ready to see yet. Blake sank onto the bed, wincing at the creak of springs beneath him. For the first time since his father's announcement that morning, he felt tears burning in his eyes. How had his life fallen apart so completely in just one day? His phone buzzed. A text from his father. "The electricity will be turned on tomorrow. Consider this your first lesson in planning ahead. Good night, son." Blake hurled the phone across the room, hearing it clatter in the darkness. Then he curled up on the thin mattress, still in his expensive clothes, and let the tears flow freely. Tomorrow, his new life would begin, whether he was ready or not. Monday morning arrived too soon. Blake stood in front of the Cedar Grove Community Center, tugging uncomfortably at the collar of the only plain white shirt he owned. The building was old but well maintained, with cheerful murals decorating its walls and children's artwork in the windows. "You must be Blake," a warm voice called out. He turned to see a woman in her early 30s approaching, keys jangling in her hand. She wore simple jeans and a purple t-shirt with the community center's logo, but something about the way she carried herself caught his attention. "I'm Janelle Robinson," she said, extending her hand. "I run the after-school programs here." Blake shook her hand, noticing how firm her grip was. He stopped himself, remembering his father's warning about using the family name. "Just Blake." Janelle's eyebrow raised slightly, but she said nothing about his hesitation. "Well, just Blake, let's get you started. You'll be helping with maintenance and basic administrative work." She led him inside, pointing out different rooms and explaining their programs. "We serve about 100 kids daily, plus senior activities in the mornings and adult education classes in the evenings. Everyone here wears multiple hats." Blake nodded absently, more focused on how clean and organized everything was. Despite the worn furniture and outdated equipment, it wasn't what he'd expected. "Your first task is to help Miss Rosa in the kitchen," Janelle said, leading him to a small but spotless cafeteria. "We provide breakfast for our senior program." An elderly woman with silver hair was struggling with a heavy box of cereal containers. Blake watched for a moment, unsure what to do, until Janelle cleared her throat pointedly. "Oh, right," he hurried forward. "Let me help you with that, Mom." Miss Rosa beamed at him. "Such a nice young man, you're much prettier than our usual volunteers." Blake heard Janelle snort behind him, but chose to ignore it. He spent the next hour helping Miss Rosa set up breakfast, learning more about the community center from her cheerful chatter. By the time the seniors started arriving, his designer shoes were killing his feet, and his back ached from lifting boxes. "Not quite the morning workout you're used to, is it?" Janelle asked during his break, sliding a cup of coffee across the staff room table. Blake looked up, surprised. "What makes you think you know what I'm used to?" "Please," Janelle laughed. "Those shoes cost more than our monthly food budget. Your watch could probably fund our summer program. You're not exactly hard to figure out." Blake felt his face grow hot. "You don't know anything about me." "I know your type," Janelle said, her voice losing its warmth. "Trust fund baby doing community service or maybe trying to build a resume for grad school. You'll be gone in a week." "You're wrong," Blake snapped, though he wasn't sure why her opinion mattered to him. "I'm here because I want to be." "Sure you are," Janelle stood up. "Break's over, the supply closet needs organizing." The rest of the day passed in a blur of mundane tasks. By closing time, Blake's muscles ached in places he didn't know existed. He watched as Janelle said goodbye to the last few children, knowing each one by name, asking about their families, reminding them about homework. "You're good with them," he said as she locked up. "They're good kids," she replied. "They just need someone to believe in them." She paused, studying him. "Same as anyone else, I suppose." Blake walked home in the fading light, his feet screaming in protest. The teenagers were on the steps again, but this time they just nodded as he passed. His apartment was still depressingly bare, but at least the electricity worked now. He collapsed onto his bed, too tired to even change clothes. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his usual party friends, but he didn't feel like explaining his situation to them. Instead, he found himself thinking about Janelle's words. They just need someone to believe in them. The next few weeks fell into a routine. Blake learned to wear more practical clothes, to pack a lunch instead of expecting to order in, to budget his meager paycheck. He discovered that Miss Rosa made the best coffee in the neighborhood and that Mr. Johnson, who taught art to the seniors, had been a famous painter in his youth. But it was Janelle who fascinated him most. She seemed to be everywhere at once, solving problems before they arose, comforting crying children, mediating teenager disputes, organizing fundraisers. She never showed signs of fatigue or frustration, though Blake knew she must feel both. One evening, as he was fixing a wobbly table in the homework room, he overheard her on the phone. "I understand the grant wasn't approved," she was saying, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "But these kids need the summer program. Many of them don't have anywhere else to go. Yes, I know budgets are tight. No, please don't apologize. We'll figure something out, we always do." She hung up and pressed her forehead against the wall, taking deep breaths. Blake pretended to focus on the table, but his mind was racing. He knew his father's foundation funded programs like this all the time. One phone call could solve everything, but that would mean revealing who he really was. And somehow, the thought of Janelle looking at him differently made his stomach twist. "Everything okay?" he asked carefully. Janelle straightened up, her smile back in place so quickly he almost thought he'd imagined her moment of weakness. Of course, just typical budget challenges. "You know," Blake said slowly, "I might have some experience with fundraising. If you want help brainstorming ideas." Janelle looked at him with surprise. "You're full of surprises, aren't you, just Blake?" They ended up working late into the evening, planning a community fair that could raise funds for the summer program. Janelle's knowledge of the community combined with Blake's event planning experience, though he carefully avoided mentioning exactly how he gained that experience, created ideas that excited them both. "This could actually work," Janelle said, looking over their notes. "Though we'll need volunteers, permits, donation." "Leave that to me," Blake said confidently. Then, seeing her skeptical look, added, "I can be very persuasive when I want to be." "I'm starting to see that," Janelle smiled, and for the first time Blake felt the full warmth of her approval. It felt better than any praise his father had ever given him. As they walked out together, the streetlights casting long shadows, Janelle turned to him. "Why are you really here, Blake, and don't give me the volunteer story again?" Blake hesitated. The truth was on the tip of his tongue, but fear held it back. "Would you believe me if I said I'm trying to figure that out myself?" Janelle studied him for a long moment. "Yes," she finally said, "I think I would." They parted ways at the corner, but Blake's steps felt lighter despite his exhaustion. For the first time since his father had cut him off, he felt like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a punishment after all. Maybe it was exactly where he needed to be. The community fair was coming together better than anyone expected. Blake had discovered that many local businesses were eager to help once someone actually asked them. He'd spent weeks visiting shops, restaurants, and small companies, slowly building support for the center's summer program. "I have to admit, I'm impressed," Janelle said one evening, as they checked off another donation on their list. They were sitting in her small office, surrounded by children's artwork and motivational posters. "How did you convince Martinez Auto Shop to donate that much?" Blake smiled, remembering how he'd spent 3 hours helping Mr. Martinez with his business's social media strategy in exchange for the donation. "Let's just say I can be resourceful when I need to be." "You're different than I thought you'd be," Janelle said softly, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Before Blake could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. They rushed out to find 2 teenagers in a heated argument, their faces inches apart. "Hey!" Janelle's voice cut through the tension. "Marcus! Deshawn! What's going on?" The boys stepped apart, but their anger was still visible. "He's been talking about my sister," Marcus spat. "Man, I didn't say nothing that wasn't true," Deshawn shot back. Blake watched in amazement as Janelle stepped between them, her presence somehow making both boys look ashamed. "My office, now, both of you." As she led them away, she called over her shoulder, "Blake, can you check on the younger kids in the art room?" Blake found himself surrounded by elementary school children working on paintings for the fair. One little girl tugged at his sleeve, showing him her work. "Mr. Blake, look, I painted my family." He knelt beside her, studying the colorful stick figures. "It's beautiful, Sarah. Who's this tall one?" "That's my big brother. He's in college now. I miss him lots." Blake felt something tug at his heart. "I bet he misses you too." Later that evening, as they were closing up, Janelle looked exhausted, but satisfied. "Marcus and Deshawn will be helping set up the fair all day Saturday. Sometimes kids just need a way to channel their energy." "You're amazing with them," Blake said. "How do you always know the right thing to say?" Janelle shrugged. "I grew up in this neighborhood. I was them not so long ago." She hesitated, then added, "Would you like to grab some coffee? There's a diner around the corner that stays open late." Blake's heart skipped a beat. "I'd like that." The diner was small but clean, with red vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that hummed softly. They ordered coffee and pie, and for a while they just talked about the fair, the kids, the community center. "Can I ask you something?" Janelle said finally. "Why did you really come here? And don't say it was your choice, because I've seen how you look at this neighborhood sometimes, like it's a foreign country." Blake stared into his coffee cup. The truth had been weighing on him for weeks now. "My father sent me," he admitted. "He cut me off, froze my accounts, arranged this job. It was supposed to be a punishment." "Supposed to be? It doesn't feel like one anymore." He looked up at her. "I mean, yes, I miss certain things. Hot water that actually stays hot. A bed that doesn't feel like it's stuffed with rocks. But here, I feel like I'm actually doing something that matters." Janelle was quiet for a long moment. "Who are you, really?" Before Blake could answer, the diner's door chimed. A group of well-dressed people entered, laughing loudly. Blake's blood ran cold as he recognized them, his old friends from his party days. "Blake!" a female voice shrieked. "Oh my God, Blake Carrington, is that you?" Blake saw Janelle's eyes widen at his last name. Madison, his ex-girlfriend, was already tottering toward their table in her designer heels. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks." Madison draped herself over him, smelling of expensive perfume and champagne. "Your father told everyone you were finding yourself or whatever, but here you are in this." She looked around with poorly concealed disgust. "Charming establishment." "Madison," Blake said stiffly, very aware of Janelle's eyes on him. "I'm kind of in the middle of something." "Oh," Madison finally seemed to notice Janelle. "How sweet. Are you doing charity work? Daddy must be so proud." Blake saw Janelle's face harden. "Actually," he started, but Janelle was already standing up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice ice cold. "I should go. Some of us have real work to do tomorrow." "Janelle, wait!" Blake called after her, but she was already out the door. Madison slid into the empty seat. "Now that she's gone, tell me everything. When are you coming back to civilization? The club isn't the same without you." Blake stood up abruptly. "I have to go." "But Blake!" He threw some money on the table and rushed out, hoping to catch Janelle. He spotted her halfway down the block. "Janelle, please, let me explain." She whirled around, her eyes blazing. "Explain what? How you're Blake Carrington, heir to the biggest real estate empire in the state. How this is all just some sort of rich boy's time out. How we're all just part of your journey of self-discovery. It's not like that. Really? Because that's exactly what it looks like." She hugged herself, suddenly looking vulnerable. "I trusted you. I thought you were different. I am different. These past weeks have changed me." "Have they? Because from where I'm standing, you're still lying about who you are." A car horn blared nearby, making them both jump. They were creating a scene on the sidewalk. "Can we talk about this somewhere private?" Blake pleaded. "No," Janelle said firmly. "I don't think we can. Go back to your friends, Blake. Go back to your real life." She turned and walked away, leaving Blake standing alone on the sidewalk, feeling like his world was crumbling all over again. But this time it wasn't his luxury lifestyle he was losing. It was something far more precious. Back in his apartment, Blake sat in the darkness, his phone buzzing with messages from Madison and his other old friends. They wanted him to come out, to party like old times. It would be so easy to fall back into that life, but all he could think about was the look in Janelle's eyes when she realized who he really was. He'd spent his whole life being Blake Carrington, heir to a fortune, life of the party, everyone's favorite rich boy. Now, for the first time, he wished he could just be Blake, the guy who helped fix wobbly tables and organized community fairs and made a difference in people's lives. His phone buzzed again, a text from his father. "I heard you ran into some old friends tonight. Ready to come home yet, son?" Blake threw the phone aside without responding. He had never felt less ready to go home, but he had no idea how to fix what he'd broken. The next morning at the community center was torture. Janelle wouldn't look at Blake, speaking to him only when absolutely necessary, and always in a coldly professional tone. The kids picked up on the tension, whispering among themselves and watching the two adults dance around each other. "Trouble in paradise?" Miss Rosa asked Blake as he helped her unload supplies. "That girl hasn't smiled all morning." "I messed up," Blake admitted, setting down a heavy box. "I wasn't honest about who I really am." Miss Rosa clicked her tongue. Ah, the Carrington boy. News travels fast in this neighborhood. Blake's head snapped up. You knew. Of course I knew. I may be old, but I read the papers. I saw your picture in that yacht accident story. She patted his arm. But I also see how you've changed since you came here. Before Blake could respond, a commotion erupted at the front entrance. His heart stopped when he heard a familiar voice. Where is my son? Walter Carrington stood in the community center's lobby, commanding attention in his perfectly tailored suit. Behind him, Rachel, Blake's mother, looked around with poorly concealed distaste. Mom, Dad, what are you doing here? Taking you home, Walter announced. This little experiment has gone on long enough. Blake noticed Janelle emerging from her office, her face unreadable. The entire center had gone quiet, everyone watching the drama unfold. I'm not going anywhere, Blake said firmly. I have work to do here. Walter laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. Work? Playing janitor in this? He waved his hand dismissively. Place? Walter, Rachel touched his arm. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss. Walter's voice grew harder. Blake, this ends now. I've heard about your little fundraising efforts. Playing at being a community organizer? That's not who we are. No, Blake shot back. That's not who you are, but it's who I want to be. Walter's face darkened. I didn't raise you to waste your life in some charity project. Mr. Carrington, Janelle's voice cut through the tension. She stepped forward, her head held high. This charity project serves hundreds of families. We provide education, safety, and hope to this community. Your son has been instrumental in helping us secure funding for our summer program. Walter turned to her, his expression calculating. Ah, Miss Robinson, I've heard about you too. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. How much would it take? Name your price to end this, whatever this is. Blake felt sick. Dad, stop it! But Walter was already writing. $100,000. That should fund your programs for what, 2 years? 3? All you have to do is encourage my son to come home where he belongs. The silence in the room was deafening. Blake looked at Janelle, seeing the conflict on her face. It was more money than they could raise in 10 community fairs. Janelle straightened her shoulders and looked Walter directly in the eye. Mr. Carrington, this community center isn't for sale, and neither am I. Everyone has a price, Walter said smoothly, adding another zero to the check. $1 million. Think of all the good you could do with that money. Blake watched as Janelle's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. The good we do here isn't just about money. It's about teaching children that they matter, that their dreams are valid, that they can become anything they want to be. What message would I be sending them if I took your money to betray someone I... She paused, glancing at Blake. Someone I care about? Care about? Walter scoffed. You've known him for what, 2 months? I'm his father. I know what's best for him. Do you? Blake stepped between his father and Janelle. You sent me here to teach me a lesson, Dad. Well, I learned one, just not the one you expected. And what lesson is that? Walter's voice dripped with sarcasm. That I don't want to be you anymore. Blake's voice grew stronger. I don't want to measure everything in dollars. I don't want to manipulate people. I don't want to look at a place like this and see only an investment opportunity. Rachel stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Blake, honey, you're confused. Let's just go home and talk about this. I'm not confused, Mom. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing clearly. He turned to his father. You can keep your money, your company, all of it. I don't want it. Walter's face turned purple. Are you ungrateful? Mr. Carrington, Miss Rosa's voice interrupted. She walked forward slowly, leaning on her cane. I've known many rich men in my life, but I've known very few wealthy ones. Walter looked at her in confusion. What's the difference? Rich is what's in your wallet. Wealthy is what's in your heart. She smiled at Blake. Your son is becoming a wealthy man. A small voice piped up from the crowd that had gathered. Mr. Blake, are you leaving us? It was Sarah, clutching her family painting. Blake knelt down to her level. No, Sarah, I'm not going anywhere. Walter stared at the scene before him, his son kneeling next to a child from the projects, his expensive clothes replaced by simple work clothes, his face showing a determination Walter had never seen before. This isn't over, Walter said finally. When you come to your senses, don't expect me to welcome you back with open arms. I won't, Blake replied quietly. They watched as Walter stormed out, Rachel following after one last tearful look at her son. The check floated to the ground, torn in half. The center remained quiet for a moment, then Miss Rosa clapped her hands. All right, show's over. Who's helping me with lunch? As the crowd dispersed, Janelle touched Blake's arm. Can we talk? They walked to her office in silence. Once inside, Janelle closed the door and leaned against it. "You turned down $1 million, Blake said softly. "You turned down $1 billion, she replied. "I meant what I said. I don't want that life anymore." Janelle stepped closer to him. "I'm sorry I didn't let you explain about your name. I was hurt, but I should have trusted the person I've gotten to know these past months. I should have been honest from the start," Blake admitted. "I was afraid you'd see me differently." "I do see you differently," Janelle said, making Blake's heart sink. But then she smiled. "I see you more clearly now than ever before." She reached up and touched his cheek gently. Blake leaned into her touch, feeling like he could finally breathe again. A knock at the door made them jump apart. "Miss Janelle," Sarah's voice called out. "Can we start painting the fair banners now?" They looked at each other and laughed. "Back to work?" Blake asked. "Back to work," Janelle agreed. But as they left the office, she caught his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. Blake squeezed back, knowing that while he might have lost his inheritance today, he had gained something far more valuable. The morning after Walter Carrington's dramatic visit, Blake woke up to find his apartment building buzzing with gossip. Everyone now knew he was a billionaire's son living in the projects. Some neighbors looked at him with newfound respect for choosing to stay, while others viewed him with suspicion, wondering what his real motives were. But Blake had bigger problems. His phone was ringing non-stop with calls from reporters wanting the story of the Carrington heirs' rebellion. Even worse, his father's threat had been more than empty words. His minimal bank account had been frozen, and his position at the community center was suddenly under scrutiny from the board of directors. "They're saying your father was a major anonymous donor," Janelle told him during their morning coffee break. Her face was tight with worry. "He's withdrawn all funding." Blake felt sick. "How much?" "Almost a third of our annual budget." Janelle ran her fingers through her hair, a gesture he'd come to recognize as a sign of stress. "The board is meeting tonight to discuss cost-cutting measures." "This is all my fault," Blake said, slumping in his chair. "No." Janelle reached across the table and took his hand. "This is your father's fault. He's punishing these kids to get to you." Before Blake could respond, Miss Rosa burst into the break room. "Turn on the TV, Channel 7. They rushed to the small TV in the corner. A news reporter stood outside the Carrington mansion, speaking solemnly. Sources close to the family say Blake Carrington's exile to Cedar Grove Heights was actually an intervention arranged by his concerned family after a series of incidents involving alcohol and reckless behavior. The young heir's recent erratic behavior, including his refusal to return home, has raised questions about his mental state. That lying... Blake couldn't even finish the sentence. His hands were shaking with anger. "They're trying to discredit you," Janelle said quietly. "Make it look like you're unstable so no one will take you seriously." The news segment continued, showing clips from the yacht accident and other embarrassing moments from Blake's past. They even interviewed Madison, who tearfully expressed concern for her dear friend. "I need some air," Blake muttered, heading for the door. But when he stepped outside, he found several reporters waiting with cameras and microphones. "Blake, is it true you're having a mental breakdown? Were you sent here as part of a rehabilitation program? What about the rumors of drug abuse?" Janelle appeared beside him, grabbing his arm. "No comment," she said firmly, pulling him back inside. They retreated to her office, where Blake paced like a caged animal. "He's trying to destroy everything. The center, my reputation. Us." "Us?" Janelle's voice was soft. Blake stopped pacing and looked at her. I hoped..." After yesterday, a knock interrupted them. It was Deshawn, one of the teenage boys from the earlier fight. "Miss Janelle? Some guys in suits are here for the board meeting early. They don't look happy." The board meeting was worse than they expected. Walter had called in favors, and several board members were pushing to completely restructure the center's programs. Words like fiscal responsibility and sustainable model were thrown around, but the message was clear. Many of their services would have to be cut. "We can't just abandon these families," Janelle argued passionately. "Where will the kids go after school? What about the senior programs? Perhaps if Mr. Carrington would consider returning to his family," one board member suggested delicately. "No," Blake stood up. "I won't let my father blackmail this community." He stormed out of the meeting and walked for hours through the neighborhood, thinking hard. When he finally returned to his apartment, he had a plan. The next morning, he asked Janelle to gather everyone in the main room. The center was packed. Staff, volunteers, parents, kids, even some board members lingered at the back. "My father thinks he can control us with money," Blake began. "He thinks without his donations, This place will fall apart. But he's wrong. This community is stronger than that. He pulled out a stack of papers. I've spent all night making calls. Remember all those local businesses we contacted for the fair? They're willing to help. Martinez Auto Shop is offering free job training for our youth program. The Garden Fresh Market will provide supplies for our senior meals. The tech startup on 5th Street wants to donate computers and teach coding classes. Murmurs of surprise and hope spread through the crowd. It won't be easy, Blake continued. We'll have to work harder, be creative with our resources, but we can do this. Together. Together, Janelle echoed, stepping forward to stand beside him. The look she gave him made his heart skip a beat. One by one, others joined them. Miss Rosa offered to organize a bake sale. Mr. Johnson said he could auction some of his paintings. Parents volunteered their time and skills. See? Blake turned to the board members. This is what community looks like. Not one rich man's checkbook, but hundreds of people working together. The board members huddled together, whispered, and finally agreed to give Blake's plan a chance. Later that evening, as they were clearing up after an impromptu planning session, Janelle pulled Blake into an empty classroom. That was amazing, she said. You're amazing. I learned from the best, he smiled. You've been showing me what real leadership looks like since I got here. Janelle stepped closer, and Blake's heart started racing. But before either of them could move, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his mother. Your father is planning something. Be careful. I love you. Blake stared at the message, a chill running down his spine. He showed it to Janelle. What do you think he's going to do? She asked. I don't know, Blake admitted. But whatever it is, we'll face it together. Janelle took his hand. Together, she agreed. Outside the classroom window, the sun was setting over Cedar Grove Heights. Somewhere across town in his mansion on the hill, Walter Carrington was plotting his next move. But for the first time in his life, Blake wasn't afraid of his father's power. He had found something stronger than money, love, community, and a purpose worth fighting for. What he didn't know was that Walter's next attack wouldn't target the community center. It would target something much more personal, a secret from Janelle's past that could tear them apart forever. The community fair was finally here. The center's playground had been transformed with colorful banners, local vendor booths, and the sound of children's laughter. Despite Walter's attempts to shut them down, the neighborhood had come together in ways Blake never thought possible. The raffle tickets are selling like crazy, Janelle reported, her face glowing with excitement. And wait until you see what Miss Rosa baked for the cakewalk. Blake couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. These past few weeks had been challenging, but they'd also brought them closer. Every obstacle his father threw at them, they overcame together. Miss Janelle! Sarah came running up, her face streaked with face paint. Your brother is here. Janelle's smile faltered for just a second, so quickly Blake almost missed it. Marcus is here. A tall man in a prison guard's uniform approached them. Despite their different complexions, the family resemblance was clear in their matching dimples and determined chin. Little sister. Marcus hugged Janelle tightly. The place looks amazing. I didn't think you could make it, Janelle said, her voice tight with emotion. And miss your big day? Never. Marcus turned to Blake, his expression cooling slightly. So you're the famous Blake Carrington. Just Blake is fine, he replied, shaking Marcus's hand. Marcus is a corrections officer at Pine Valley State, Janelle explained. He's the reason I started working with at-risk youth. Before they could talk more, a commotion broke out by the cotton candy machine. Duty calls, Janelle said, hurrying away. Marcus watched her go, then fixed Blake with a stern look. Walk with me. They moved away from the crowds towards the quiet end of the playground. My sister likes you, Marcus said finally. She hasn't looked this happy in years. I care about her too, Blake said. Then you should know something. Marcus stopped walking. Your father's investigators were at the prison last week, asking questions about Janelle. Blake felt his stomach drop. What kind of questions? About what happened 10 years ago. About Michael. Michael? Marcus sighed heavily. Michael was Janelle's fiancé. He was one of my inmates. Blake felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. She was engaged to an inmate? It's not what you think, Marcus said quickly. Michael was a good kid who made one stupid mistake, got caught up in a robbery gone wrong, but he was turning his life around. He and Janelle met when she was volunteering at the prison literacy program. What happened to him? There was a riot. Michael saved my life, but Marcus's voice cracked. He didn't make it. Janelle was devastated. She left town for 2 years afterward. When she came back, she threw herself into working with troubled youth, trying to prevent other kids from making the same mistakes. Blake ran his hands through his hair, processing this information. Why are you telling me this? Because your father's people were very interested in Michael's criminal record, in the fact that Janelle was engaged to a convicted felon. Marcus's eyes hardened. They're going to try to use this against her, make it look like she has a history of getting involved with the wrong kind of men. I won't let them hurt her, Blake said firmly. You might not have a choice. The media around here, they're not kind to people like us. One whiff of scandal and they'll tear her apart. The center's reputation will suffer, all her work with the kids. There has to be a way to stop this. There is, a familiar voice said behind them. They turned to see Walter Carrington standing there, immaculate in his designer suit. Come home, Blake, end this ridiculous rebellion, and I'll make sure Miss Robinson's past stays buried. Blake's hands clenched into fists. You're blackmailing me with Janelle's personal tragedy. I'm offering you a chance to protect her, Walter corrected smoothly. Think about it. Once this gets out, how long before parents start questioning whether she should be working with their children? How long before the board decides she's a liability? You're a monster, Blake whispered. I'm a father trying to save his son from making a terrible mistake. Walter straightened his tie. You have until tomorrow to decide. Either you come home and take your rightful place in the company, or Miss Robinson's story hits the morning news. He walked away, leaving Blake and Marcus standing in shocked silence. What are you going to do? Marcus asked quietly. Before Blake could answer, they heard Janelle calling them. There you are. The talent show is about to start. She stopped when she saw their faces. What's wrong? Blake forced a smile. Nothing. Just getting to know your brother. But as they walked back to the fair, Blake's mind was racing. He couldn't let his father destroy Janelle's reputation. But the thought of leaving her, of going back to his old life, it felt like having his heart ripped out. That evening, after the fair was over and the cleanup complete, Janelle found Blake sitting alone on the playground swings. Today was perfect, she said, taking the swing next to him. We raised enough money to keep the summer program running and then some. Blake looked at her, really looked at her. She was beautiful in the fading light, her face tired but happy, still wearing the silly volunteer t-shirt they'd all worn for the fair. The thought that his father could hurt her made him feel physically ill. Janelle, he started, not sure what he was going to say. I need to tell you something. But before he could continue, she leaned over and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, sweet and full of promise. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. I think I'm falling in love with you, she whispered. Blake felt his heart soar and break at the same time. How could he tell her now? How could he explain that to protect her? He might have to leave her. You don't have to say anything, she continued, misreading his silence. I know this is complicated. I know we come from different worlds, but today proved that doesn't matter. Together, we can overcome anything. Blake pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize everything about this moment. Tomorrow he would have to make an impossible choice, but tonight he just wanted to hold her, to pretend that love really could conquer all. What neither of them knew was that someone had taken pictures of their kiss, pictures that were already on their way to every major news outlet in the city, along with a very different version of Janelle's past than the truth Blake had just learned. Blake woke up to his phone exploding with notifications. The morning news was everywhere. Carrington heirs new love hiding criminal past. Community center director's prison romance revealed. Troubled youth worker's dark secret. His hands shaking, he opened one of the articles. There it was, the picture of him and Janelle kissing on the playground swing, alongside old mugshots of Michael and twisted details about the prison riot. They'd even dug up quotes from anonymous sources, suggesting Janelle had a pattern of getting involved with criminals and troubled men. Blake's phone rang, Janelle's number, but before he could answer, another call came in, and another. His social media was flooded with messages from old friends, society gossips, and reporters all wanting comments about the scandal. He tried calling Janelle back, but it went straight to voicemail. Throwing on clothes, he rushed to the community center, only to find news vans parked outside and reporters swarming the entrance. Blake, is it true your father disapproves of the relationship? Did you know about her engagement to a convicted felon? Are you following in her pattern of dating criminals? Blake pushed through them without commenting, his heart pounding. Inside, the center was eerily quiet. He found Miss Rosa in the kitchen, her eyes red from crying. Where is she? He asked. In her office. The board called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Miss Rosa touched his arm. They're saying terrible things about her, Blake. Such terrible things. Blake found Janelle sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen, Multiple news sites were open, all running variations of the same story. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. "Janelle, I'm so sorry. My father—" "I know," she cut him off. "Marcus told me about your conversation yesterday, about your father's ultimatum." Blake fell into the chair across from her. "I was going to tell you." "When?" She finally looked at him, her eyes full of pain. "After the kiss. After I told you I was falling in love with you." "I didn't know how," Blake admitted. "I was trying to figure out a way to stop him." "Well, now you don't have to." Janelle turned her screen around, showing him an email from the board. "They're asking for my resignation. Apparently my history of poor judgment makes me unsuitable to work with children." "We'll fight this," Blake said fiercely. "We'll tell them the truth about Michael, about how he was turning his life around, about how he died a hero." "The truth doesn't matter." Janelle's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Look at what they're saying. They're painting me as some kind of criminal sympathizer, someone who can't be trusted around children. All my work, everything I've built here." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Deshawn and Marcus, both looking angry. "Some reporters are talking to the parents," Deshawn reported, "saying they should pull their kids out of our programs." Marcus's face was grim. "And the prison administration called. They're reviewing my position due to not disclosing my sister's relationship with an inmate, even though it was 10 years ago and I wasn't even working there then." Janelle put her head in her hands. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I never meant for this to affect you." "This isn't your fault." Blake stood up, anger coursing through him. "It's my father's, and I'm going to end this right now." He pulled out his phone and dialed Walter's number. It rang once before his father's smooth voice answered. "Ready to come home, son?" "No." Blake's voice was ice cold. "I'm ready to go to war." There was a pause. "Don't be dramatic, Blake. You can't win this. Watch me. You want a media scandal? How about your son exposing how you tried to blackmail an innocent woman? How you're destroying a community center just to control me? How you're willing to hurt children to get your way? No one will believe you," Walter said, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Won't they? I have texts, witnesses, the board members you pressured. And unlike you, I'm telling the truth." Another pause. "And you'd really destroy our family's reputation?" "You taught me well, Dad. Sometimes you have to be willing to burn it all down." Blake hung up and turned to find everyone staring at him. "Did you mean that?" Janelle asked softly. "Would you really go public against your own father?" "In a heartbeat," Blake said. "But first we need to get ahead of this story. Marcus, call every reporter outside. Tell them we're giving one interview, but it has to be live. No editing, no twisting our words." "You want to go on live TV?" Deshawn's eyes were wide. "We're going to tell the truth, all of it, about Michael, about my father's blackmail, about what this center really means to the community." Blake looked at Janelle. "If you're willing." Janelle stood up slowly. "You know this could backfire. Your father's influence runs deep. Then we'll need backup." Blake turned to Deshawn. "Get everyone here. The kids, their parents, Miss Rosa, Mr. Johnson, everyone whose life this center has touched. Let them tell their stories too." Within an hour, the center was packed. The local news had set up cameras in the main room, where chairs had been arranged for a town hall-style interview. Families poured in, many carrying handmade signs supporting Janelle. Just before they went live, Blake pulled Janelle aside. "Are you sure about this? Once we do this, there's no going back." Janelle squared her shoulders. "Michael died protecting people he cared about. I won't let his memory be twisted into something ugly. And I won't let your father destroy everything we've built here." She reached for his hand, and Blake took it, squeezing gently. Together, they walked into the main room, ready to face the cameras, ready to fight for their love and their community. What they didn't know was that someone else was watching the broadcast preparations with great interest. Rachel Carrington, Blake's mother, who had finally decided it was time to choose between her husband and her son. And in her designer handbag was a file containing evidence of Walter's own secrets, secrets that could change everything. The television lights felt hot and intrusive as Blake and Janelle sat side by side in front of the cameras. The community center's main room was packed with supporters, their presence a silent wall of strength behind them. The reporter, Linda Chen from Channel 7 News, adjusted her microphone. "We're live in 5, 4, 3... The cameraman counted down silently with his fingers. "Good evening, I'm Linda Chen, coming to you live from the Cedar Grove Community Center, where a story of romance and scandal has captivated our city. With me are Blake Carrington, heir to the Carrington fortune and Janelle Robinson, the center's director, Linda turned to them with practiced concern. Miss Robinson, let's address the allegations directly. You were engaged to a convicted felon? Janelle took a deep breath. Yes, I was engaged to Michael Torres 10 years ago. He was serving time for being the getaway driver in a robbery where no one was hurt. He was 19, scared, and made a terrible mistake. But in prison he changed his life. He got his GED, took college courses, mentored other inmates. And how did this relationship develop? I was volunteering with the prison literacy program. Michael was different from the others. Gentle, thoughtful, determined to make amends. We fell in love, yes, but it was his goodness that drew me to him, not his mistakes. He died a hero, Marcus spoke up from the audience. As a prison guard, I witnessed it. During the riot, Michael saved my life and 3 others before. His voice cracked. Suddenly, the center's doors burst open. Walter Carrington strode in, his face thunderous. This ends now. Blake, get away from those cameras. But before he could reach them, another figure stepped into his path. Rachel Carrington, elegant as always in her designer suit, but with steel in her eyes. No, Walter, you're not stopping this. Rachel, don't be foolish. I've been foolish for 28 years, Rachel cut him off. She turned to Linda Chen. I have a story to tell, if you're interested in the truth about Walter Carrington. The reporter's eyes lit up. Mrs. Carrington, please join us. Walter grabbed Rachel's arm. Think very carefully about what you're about to do. Rachel pulled away from him. I've thought about nothing else since you started this cruel campaign against our son. She walked to the interview area, her heels clicking on the floor. Blake stared at his mother in shock as she sat down beside him. The truth is, Rachel began, her voice clear and strong, Walter Carrington's fortune didn't come from his business genius. It came from me. My family's money built his empire, but there was a condition in my father's will. If I ever divorced Walter, everything would go to charity. A murmur ran through the crowd. Walter's face had gone pale. So when Walter began his affairs, I stayed quiet. When he manipulated and bullied our son, I looked away. But I won't stay quiet anymore. She opened her handbag and pulled out a file. These are records of Walter's business dealings for the past 20 years. The bribes, the blackmail, the destroyed lives. Mrs. Carrington, Linda Chen leaned forward eagerly. Are you saying your husband's business practices were illegal? Some were questionable, some were unethical, and some, Rachel looked directly at Walter, were definitely illegal. You'll regret this, Walter snarled. No, Rachel's voice was firm. I regret not doing it sooner. I regret letting you twist our son into your image. But Blake found his way back to himself, no thanks to us, and I won't let you destroy that. Blake felt tears in his eyes. Mom, Rachel touched his cheek gently. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You're becoming a better man than your father ever was. Linda Chen was practically vibrating with excitement. Mr. Carrington, would you care to respond to these allegations? Walter looked around the room, at the cameras, the hostile faces in the crowd, his wife's unwavering stare, and finally at his son, sitting tall beside the woman he loved. This interview is over, he spat, turning to leave. Actually, a new voice called out, it's not. Everyone turned to see a group of men in suits entering the center. One held up a badge. FBI, Mr. Carrington, we'd like to ask you some questions about certain financial transactions. The room erupted in chaos. Cameras swung to capture Walter's face as the FBI agents approached him. Reporter Linda Chen was speaking rapidly into her microphone, trying to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. In the midst of it all, Janelle gripped Blake's hand. Are you okay? Blake watched as his father was led away, his mother speaking quietly with the FBI agents. I don't know, he admitted. But I will be. Miss Rosa pushed through the crowd to reach them. The phone's been ringing off the hook, other community centers calling to offer support, and the board members, they're falling all over themselves to apologize to Janelle. Of course they are, Marcus said dryly. Nobody wants to be on the wrong side of this story now. Linda Chen turned back to Blake and Janelle. So after all this drama, what happens next for you two? Blake looked at Janelle, seeing all the love and strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. Whatever happens, he said, we face it together. Janelle smiled, tears shining in her eyes. Together, she agreed. Later that night, after the cameras had gone and the excitement had died down, Blake and Janelle stood in the quiet community center, the place that had changed both their lives forever. You could have avoided all this, Janelle said softly, if you'd just gone back when your father demanded. No, Blake pulled her close. That wasn't an option. Not after I found out what real love looks like. Not after I learned what really matters. Outside, reporters were still camped out, waiting for more details of the Carrington scandal. Blake's phone was full of messages from old friends and business associates, some offering support, others distancing themselves from the family drama. His mother was at the FBI office, sharing everything she knew about Walter's dealings. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered. Blake had lost his inheritance but found his purpose, lost his father but reconnected with his mother, lost his old life but found a love worth fighting for. "What do you think happens now?" Janelle asked. Before Blake could answer, they heard voices in the hallway. It was Deshawn and some of the other teens, staying late to clean up after all the excitement. "Now," Blake said, smiling, "we get back to work. We have a community to serve." What they didn't know was that Walter Carrington, sitting in an FBI interrogation room, was already plotting his revenge. He might be down, but he wasn't out. And he had one last card to play, a secret that could shake Blake and Janelle's newly secure happiness to its core. Last edited Ha 6 Minutos. 2 weeks after Walter's arrest, life at the Cedar Grove Community Center was finally returning to normal. The media circus had died down, and the center was thriving with renewed community support and funding from legitimate donors who'd been moved by their story. Blake sat in what used to be his father's office at Carrington Enterprises, surrounded by boxes. After Walter's arrest, the board had asked Blake to step in temporarily to help stabilize the company. He'd agreed on one condition, that the company establish a major charitable foundation focused on community development, with Janelle as one of the directors. "You've barely touched these files," Rachel said, entering with 2 cups of coffee. She looked different now, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I know, it's just strange being here." Blake accepted the coffee gratefully. "Have you heard from Dad's lawyers?" Rachel's face tightened. "They're pushing for a plea deal. The evidence I provided is too strong to fight. But Walter's been refusing visitors, even his attorneys. That's not like him." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was James, their old driver, now working as Blake's assistant. "Mr. Blake, there's someone here to see you, says it's urgent." A woman entered, middle-aged, expensively dressed, with a familiar, calculating look that reminded Blake of his father's business associates. "Margaret Wells," she introduced herself. "I was your father's personal attorney for many years." Blake stood. "My father's legal team has already—" "I'm not here about the criminal cases," Margaret interrupted. "I'm here about Michael Torres." Blake felt his blood run cold. "What about him?" Margaret placed a thick file on the desk. "Your father had me investigate everything about Michael Torres and Janelle Robinson 10 years ago. Not just the publicly available records, everything. Why would my father investigate them back then? He didn't. The investigation was recent, but it covered their entire history, and we found something interesting." She opened the file. "Michael Torres isn't dead." The coffee cup slipped from Blake's hand, shattering on the floor. "What?" "The riot was real, yes, and Torres did save several lives, but afterward, he was placed in witness protection. He had information about corrupt prison officials, and his death was staged to protect him." "That's impossible," Blake whispered. Janelle mourned him. Her brother Marcus. Marcus knew, Margaret said quietly. He had to know, as a prison guard involved in the protection scheme. But he was under strict orders never to tell anyone, not even his sister. Rachel moved to Blake's side. "Why are you telling us this now?" "Because your father's last instruction to me, before his arrest, was to locate Michael Torres. And I did." She pulled out a photograph. "He's living in Arizona under the name Michael Rodriguez. Married, 2 kids. Blake stared at the photo. A man about his age, playing with 2 young children in a suburban backyard. He looked happy, ordinary, alive. "Does Janelle know?" he managed to ask. "No, but she will." Margaret's voice was cold. "Your father arranged for this information to be delivered to her today, along with proof that her brother knew the truth all along." Blake was already pulling out his phone, but Janelle wasn't answering. He tried Marcus next, straight to voicemail. "Why?" Blake demanded. "Why would my father do this now?" "Because he knows it will destroy everything," Rachel said softly. Janelle's trust in her brother, her ability to believe in love again, and possibly her trust in you, since you're the one who brought all this pain back into her life. Blake was already heading for the door. "I have to find her." "Blake," Margaret called after him. "There's more. Michael wants to see her. When we contacted him, he said he's always regretted not being able to say goodbye. He's flying in tomorrow." Blake felt like the floor was tilting under his feet. Michael was alive. Michael was coming back. Michael, Janelle's first love, The man she'd never really gotten to mourn properly, was married with children but wanted to see her again. "Son," Rachel touched his arm. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Blake admitted. "But I have to talk to Janelle before she hears this from anyone else." He drove to the community center first, but Miss Rosa said Janelle had left early, looking upset. "She had a strange envelope," Miss Rosa added. "After she read it, she just left." Blake tried her apartment next, then her favorite coffee shop, the park where they sometimes had lunch. Finally, he thought of one last place, the playground where they'd first kissed. He found her there, sitting on the same swing, staring at papers scattered around her feet. When she looked up at him, her eyes were red and swollen. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice raw. "I just found out," Blake said. "My father's lawyer." "No," Janelle cut him off. "Did you know when you first came here? Was this all part of some game? Your father sending you here, getting close to me?" "No, Janelle, I swear, I had no idea about any of this. He's alive, Blake. All these years, while I grieved, while I blamed myself for encouraging him to help during the riot. He was alive, building a new life, having children." Her voice broke. "And Marcus knew. My own brother let me suffer." Blake moved toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't. Please, I can't trust anything right now, anyone." "I love you," Blake said desperately. "That's real. That's true. Is it? Or am I just another project for you? The sad woman with a tragic past, someone you could save?" "You know that's not true." Janelle stood up, gathering the scattered papers. "Michael wants to see me. Tomorrow. He says he needs to explain." Blake felt his heart constricting. "Are you going to meet him?" "I don't know." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I don't know anything anymore. I need time." "I understand," Blake said, though the words felt like glass in his throat. "But Janelle, please remember, what we have, it's not about the past. It's not about Michael or my father or anything else. It's about us, about who we've become together." She didn't respond, just walked past him toward her car. But she paused for a moment, not looking back. "The hardest part isn't that Michael is alive. It's that everyone I trusted most lied to me. My brother, the man I was going to marry. How can I ever trust anyone again?" She left Blake standing alone in the growing darkness, the weight of his father's final revenge pressing down on him. Walter had found the perfect weapon, not a lie, but a truth so painful it could destroy everything Blake and Janelle had built together. Somewhere in Arizona, Michael Torres was packing a bag, preparing to face the woman he'd left behind. In his prison cell, Walter Carrington was probably smiling, knowing the chaos he'd unleashed. And in Cedar Grove Heights, two people who loved each other were caught in the middle of it all, their future hanging by a thread. Blake couldn't sleep. He spent the night pacing his small apartment, watching the sun rise over Cedar Grove Heights. Today, Michael Torres would arrive in town. Today, everything could change. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Your father's smiling in his cell. Don't let him win." But how could he fight this? This wasn't like the other battles with his father. He couldn't throw money at it, couldn't expose any secrets, couldn't rally the community. This was about Janelle's heart, and she had every right to follow it wherever it led. At the community center, everyone could feel the tension. Miss Rosa kept bringing Blake cups of coffee he couldn't drink. The kids were unusually quiet, picking up on the adults' anxiety. "She called in sick," Marcus said, appearing in Blake's makeshift office. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept either. "I tried to go see her, but she won't open the door." "Can you blame her?" Blake asked quietly. Marcus slumped into a chair. "I wanted to tell her so many times, but it was classified information. If I had revealed Michael was in witness protection, it could have put him in danger. Put her in danger too." "You could have found a way," Blake said. "Some way to help her heal without betraying Michael's secret." "Like you found a way to tell her about your father's blackmail?" Marcus shot back. Blake fell silent. They were both guilty of keeping secrets to protect Janelle, and both had ended up hurting her instead. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Blake saw a man getting out of a taxi. Even after 10 years, even only having seen him in photographs, Blake knew immediately it was Michael. He looked different from his prison photos. Older, of course, but also softer somehow. More settled. He carried himself like a man who had found peace. "He's really here," Marcus whispered. Michael entered the center, looking around with a mix of curiosity and nostalgia. When he saw Marcus, a complicated expression crossed his face. "Marcus," he said softly. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, then strode forward and wrapped Michael in a fierce hug. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry." Blake watched them, feeling like an intruder. He turned to leave, but Michael's voice stopped him. "You must be Blake Carrington." Blake turned back. "Just Blake is fine." Michael smiled slightly. "That's what Janelle said in the interview. I saw it online. You two standing up to your father, defending this place, defending each other." An awkward silence fell. Finally, Blake had to ask, "Why did you come back?" "Because Janelle deserves the truth. And because—" Michael hesitated. "Because I need to thank her. Loving her, losing her, it shaped who I became. My wife knows all about her, about how she taught me to believe in second chances." Before Blake could respond, the center's door opened again. Janelle stood there looking small and uncertain. "Michael!" The room seemed to hold its breath. Michael turned, and for a moment they just stared at each other. Two people who had once planned to spend their lives together, now virtual strangers. "Hello, Janelle," Michael said gently. Janelle's eyes filled with tears. "You're alive. You're really alive." She swayed slightly, and Blake instinctively moved to support her, but she steadied herself, wrapping her arms around her middle. "Could we?" She glanced around at everyone watching. "Could we talk privately?" Michael nodded. They walked to Janelle's office, closing the door behind them. Blake felt like his heart was being squeezed in a vice. This was it. This was how he lost her. But then he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Miss Rosa. "Come help me in the kitchen," she said firmly. "Standing here staring at that door won't make anything better." For the next hour, Blake helped Miss Rosa prepare lunch for the senior program. She kept him busy, talking about everything except what was happening in Janelle's office. Finally, the office door opened. Michael emerged first, his eyes red, but with a peaceful smile. Janelle followed, also looking like she'd been crying, but somehow lighter. They spoke quietly for a few more minutes. Then, to Blake's surprise, Michael hugged Janelle, kissed her cheek, and walked out of the center without looking back. Janelle stood there for a moment, then turned to Marcus. "We need to talk." Brother and sister disappeared into her office. This time, Blake could hear raised voices, crying, what sounded like something being thrown. But when they emerged, they were holding hands. "I'm still angry," Janelle told Marcus. "It's going to take time." "I know," Marcus replied. "I'll earn back your trust. I promise." Finally, Janelle turned to Blake. "Walk with me?" They ended up back at the playground, their spot. The swings creaked gently in the breeze. "Michael's happy," Janelle said after a long silence. "He has a beautiful family, a good life. He's not the same person I knew, and I'm not the same person who loved him." "What happened?" Blake asked softly. "We talked about everything, the riot, the witness protection program, his new life. He apologized for not finding some way to let me know he was alive. And," she took a deep breath, "he thanked me, said loving me, taught him how to love his wife, how to be a good father." She turned to Blake. "He also said something else. He said watching that interview, seeing us together, he knew I'd found what he found, a love that makes you better, that challenges you to grow." Hope flickered in Blake's chest. "And what did you say?" "I said he was right." Janelle stood up from the swing. "What I felt for Michael was real, but it was a beginning, teaching both of us how to love. What I feel for you, it's different, it's stronger, it's built on who we are now, not who we used to be." Blake stood too, hardly daring to breathe. "Even after everything my father did, your father tried to use my past to break us apart. Instead, he gave me closure I never knew I needed." She stepped closer to him. "I'm not angry about Michael anymore. I'm grateful he's happy. But I'm even more grateful that losing him led me here, to this center, to these kids, to you. I love you," Blake said simply. "I love you too." Janelle reached up to touch his face. "No more secrets?" "No more secrets," he promised. Their kiss was interrupted by cheering. They turned to find the center's kids watching from the windows, Miss Rosa wiping her eyes, Marcus trying not to smile. 1 month later, the community center's new sign was being unveiled, the Torres Robinson Center for Youth Development. Michael's wife and children had come for the ceremony, along with Rachel Carrington and a host of community members. Walter, still awaiting trial, had sent one last threat through his lawyers, but this time no one was afraid. The truth had already come out, and love had proven stronger than secrets. Blake watched as Janelle hugged Michael's children, laughing at something his wife said. Marcus stood nearby, gradually finding his place in his sister's life again. Miss Rosa was already planning their wedding, though Blake hadn't even proposed yet. But he would. The ring was hidden in his apartment, waiting for the perfect moment. Not because she was his redemption or his path to happiness, but because together they had built something real and lasting. His phone buzzed. Another text from his father. "You could have had everything." Blake looked around at the community he'd grown to love, at the woman who had taught him what really mattered, at the life he'd chosen for himself. "I already do," he whispered, and turned off his phone. The end.